Hanno. I'm sorry, my German is not good enough to... Know this?
Yeah.
My German is not good enough to speak to you in German. And, well, as Hanno said, I'm really a specialist of Jews in the European context. And to start with, you have to understand that when I went to Israel in 2011, I go there every year because there's a presidential conference done by Shimon Peres, and I was lecturing at the University of European Jewish Affairs. I had no intention of writing this book. I started speaking around to various people, colleagues, people in the street, in the summer of 2011, 2 months before the tent movement began in Tel Aviv. And I was both euphoric about what was going on inside Israeli society and totally depressed at the same time. And I came home and spoke about this to some people who said, you should write a book. And that is how the book was born. So I actually did not interview anyone. I did not do a sociological analysis of Israel. I did not tour Israel. I was a series of reflections that came out of the conversations. And the basis, the main point of my reflection was that in 2011, that was sort of coming back, but not really. There were still going gung-ho things about measuring kilometers that would be exchanged for a future peace process. You take a land swap here, you take a land swap there, and that was certainly done by the Europeans and the Americans. But what I saw inside Israeli society was simply that no one even cared, no one even mentioned the peace process. People were talking about a million other things, but not that. And in the process of seeing the euphoria of this country that, you know, was poor when it was created, started developing avocados. The metaphor is wonderful in French because avocat is both avocado and lawyer in French. So it went through the avocado phase and then the lawyer phase and then the creation and so forth. Now it's into the high-tech, ultra-modern, globalized, planetary Israel phase. And it dawned on me that the reality of Israel had very little to do with the image that people still had of Israel. And so this is why I basically sat down and wrote this essay by saying Israel has moved. Now the first question people will ask me is, where has it gone? And my reply is that it is very much still sitting where the GPSs of the world put it, but given the neighborhood in which it's living and the chances of any durable peace in that neighborhood, it's moved mentally, culturally, economically, well beyond the little place it occupies in the Middle East. So it's moved in such a way that when you go on the Tel Aviv beautiful boardwalk, sometimes you ask yourself, are the people roller skating there aware that they're sitting in Tel Aviv with Gaza a few kilometers to the south and of course the Hezbollah a few kilometers to the north, or do they think they're in Santa Monica? And there is this feeling of maybe the sun sets in both places on the beach and therefore there's a confusion of identities. And I started reflecting on this because I felt that just the Israelis were no longer where people expected them to be, and they really think they're somewhere, and I came to the conclusion, on a planet of their own, perhaps even in a cyberspace of their own. As I reflected increasingly on my encounters there, and I can mention a few later, what came out of this particular thing was that there was another reason I felt that Israel was not where we thought it was, because if you had interrogated any specialist of Israel or any person committed or interested by Israel, the first thing they would have told you is, this is a highly fractured society and country. You have the religious camp, you have the lay camp, you have the pessimists, you have the optimists, you have the cosmopolitans, you have the patriots, you have a whole series of divisions. And I came out of that first trip in 2011, I returned also in 2012, with the conviction that, no, a new Israeli man had been created. Not in the sense of the old Zionist notion that the new Israeli man would be wearing khaki shorts and planting soil and being the absolute opposite of the, thank you, the absolute opposite of the bent, stooped, fearful, diasporic Jew of the past. But no, an entirely different Israeli man who, by the nature of the society that had developed in the last 40, 45 years, was moving in different identities and in different contexts. And to me, few examples of why this man is perhaps a woman, Israeli citizen. I'm speaking here mainly of Israeli Jews for the time being, of course, was that this creature, shall we say, is a symbiosis of all the different currents. And first of all, it has Hebrew in common, a new language, but this is true now of the Haredim as well, whereas in the past there would be a good chunk of Israeli society that spoke no Hebrew, only used it for prayer and spoke Yiddish. The religious secular divide is also somewhat abated, and we can discuss this, I hope, because to me there is a new ethnic nationalist definition of one's belonging to the state. The old Zionist dream of creating a kind of European socialist humanist state for the Jews that would be more or less a piece of Europe has evaporated, and there has come out a state which is very proud of its nationalist identity, very much shared by left and right. And in a sense, I would say that it's a state which, despite the very long history, and of course the Holocaust, it's a state that is not so interested in history. It's got memory, tons of memory, but necessarily historical. And when I say that Israel has moved, I make a provocative statement, which I will try to strengthen here, and here one has to make a major distinction between the civil society of Israel, the people that you will see so magnificently in the exhibit downstairs, and there you see inside Israel a society which has all sorts of people, all sorts of Jews, all sorts of even Africans or Asians. The people who live inside Israel are much more complex, variegated in their identities than the state apparatus or the national incarnation of the state. This is true for most of our societies, and Israel is not an exception. I will be speaking here about the Israeli state, the Israeli people, the vibrancy of the social or the civil society, of the culture, of the novels, of the films, you all know very well, because it's one of the most advanced, variegated, open civil societies. What interested me here in terms of Israel that has moved is that on one end the people think they're in Santa Monica, but on the other end the state is taking on some preoccupying identities which, and I will be very provocative here, might make it more compatible with an Asia than with the old Western world from which Israel came. What do I mean by that? I mean simply that if we think of our West for the time being as sort of built on a kind of post-war never again, so universal values, the absolute incarnation and priority given to citizenship, to all citizens, absolutely no to an ethnic nation state after the whole horror of the Fortgesetz and of the Nazi past. If you analyze this in terms of a consensual, pluralist, and also supranational construct, you realize very quickly that the never again of the Jews and of Israel has been quite different. It's a never again based on never again shall the Jews allow themselves to be slaughtered the way they were, or lose control over their destiny. Consequently, Israel is a state that is for the Jews, by the Jews, and with the Jews, with a problematic minority in its midst, and a state that has accepted for a long time, of course, the United Nations that gave it birth, but you know the press as much as I do. It is basically quite allergic to any international commission or international context because it's assumed, and it's the case that the United Nations had turned into a circus of charlatanism with respect to issues like human rights, where Syria was at one point actually chairing the Commission for Human Rights. So it's a symptom that, through the Israeli prism, you see all the faults of our post-war never again. But at the same time, Israel itself is not built along those lines. Clear national borders, no notion of reconciliation because there was no one when it made War II. You don't reconcile yourself, certainly with the dead Nazis. And a kind of very complex structuring of the identity, which is we are completely responsible for our future. We decide what has to be done and needs to be done, and we will not listen to anyone else except for a polite smile. And if you look at the politics of Israel in the last decades, you can see very well that Israel wants to go at it alone. So why do I speak about Asia? Well, because all the major important countries of Asia, and I'm being provocative here, are ethno-nationalist states. I mean, the Chinese are Han, they have minorities, the Japanese are Japanese, and the Koreans are Koreans, and they may have others in their midst, but the point of having a China is for the Han people to flourish. The point of having a Japan is for the Japanese, even though they may have Koreans for 150 years, they'll never become Japanese in the process. So maybe it's, and then more important, Israel was built on the great humanist Enlightenment hopes that meant that the great values were basically technological, scientific, human, social, political progress went hand in hand as a child of the Aufklärung, the secular Zionist ideal. Now there's a much more interesting notion whereby I felt, as I spoke and reflected on this issue before me, that nowadays you can have neutral technology at the most advanced levels, and Israel has become one of the key international actors practically in every scientific field and medical field. You can have a neutral technology without the accompanying baggage of the Aufklärung. There's a pessimism built into the identity because of the neighborhood. There is a notion of science as neutral. You do it because you do it and it exists. But it doesn't bring with it the old baggage of society, justice, and various values that came along with it. And in this sense, it's also much more of an Asian concept, because the Asians will lack technological progress, economic and scientific progress, without listening for 2 seconds to the notion of human rights, for instance. It's not part of their baggage at all. I could pursue this, and I'm being extremely provocative. I'm saying this every 3 minutes so that you do not really think that I'm here lecturing so that Israel, we will all go and pack boxes so that Israel can move into deep Asia. But there's also something else. History. What we know is history. Clio, the muse, the Greek muse, and the Latin muse. It's all about interacting with others. In other words, this little peninsula of Asia called Europe, every single population interacted with other populations for better or worse for the past 1,500 years. History is the identity one grows up with next to somebody else, battles, peace, and so forth. This kind of history is perhaps not very vital for the new Jewish entity, which is Israel, because that particular entity is based on memory, the memory of the Jewish, long Jewish past. Now, memory is not history, it's not about interaction, it's about what people do to you, horrible things, or small memories of a vibrant life, such as this museum incarnates, of people sitting amongst others with whom they may or may not interact, but with a clear Jewish identity. Now, you can ask yourself, history and memory are not necessarily compatible. Europe is chock full of history. Israel is chock full of memory. And even the past with the battles go into the memory front because, as this is a common sentence around Israelis most often, except for the most extreme peace camp, we don't have anyone to talk to. We cannot negotiate with anybody. It's true, but it's also a very convenient manner of remaining sort of in one's own world, which then one can transport in other dimensions. So for me, this is it's a provocative, but it's also something that one has to take into account, because if you take Israel and put it into our Western context, and I mean West all the way to Australia, what do you get? People who will say, but wait a minute, Arab citizens aren't quite getting the same rights as they should. What about your universal values? Where is your separation between church and state, or synagogue and state? I mean, all sorts of things that we've come to associate with a Western context. And what Israel can say, but look at our pluralist society and its absolute, dynamic civil society. But if you go and look at the corridors of power, I'm making the argument that the way power is being structured today, it might be best off with China, because if it goes west, it's going to get clobbered on the head. Boycotts, human rights activists, you name it. If it moves east toward a Chinese Asian context, then it's not going to be clobbered about this. I mean, these are things that the Asians don't care about, and they take Israel as it is. Now, does this make any sense? Well, we're in a global world. Consequently, if Israel moves to Asia in terms of trade and other things, you could say, well, it's just doing like what everybody else is doing. I mean, if Angela Merkel can do it for China and solar panels, why doesn't Israel also get itself involved in its selling arms? I would like to make a small qualification here and say too simply that this is a country, minuscule, and that the Chinese are fascinated by Israel and the Jews in ways that are not just about the West. The Chinese are fascinated with the other one people that has a pedigree as old as theirs. Consequently, if the French are around, the Germans will do pragmatic things, but the Jews fascinate them because they also sit, and they didn't sit in their land forever, but they have a plurimillennial pedigree. And there's a fascination. I'll give you one small statistic. The entire Jewish people, 13 million people, let's say, maximum, 13.5, I don't know, okay? We're talking at that line, is less than the statistical error accepted by professional demographers for the Chinese census. In other words, when you count Chinese, you say, more or less 15 million might be there or not there. It doesn't matter. We've done our professional work. So for the Chinese to imagine that the statistical error of their